Hello friends, welcome you to this session wherein we'll be discussing the MRTP Act 1969. Um, well, just to give you a disclaimer right in the beginning, see, MRTP Act 1969 is part of your syllabus, but the reality is that it is no more part of the statute books. It's no more a law here in India. It has been repealed and it has been replaced by the Competition Act 2002. However, since it is part of the syllabus, we have to discuss it. In any case, it will help you understand how the policies of the government, how the policies of the regulatory bodies, how they have evolved in India after independence. What was the objective when this particular act was formulated back in 1969, almost 50 years back? What led to a change in MRTP Act? What led to it getting repealed and what led to it getting replaced by the Competition Act 2002? So though it is not part of the statute books anymore, you have to study it to get an understanding of how the regulatory regime in India evolved after independence, and probably this is the reason why this has been given in the syllabus. Right, so let us discuss the MRTP Act 1969. What do we mean by MRTP? Monopolies and Restrictive Trade Practices Act 1969. I hope you understand what a monopoly is. Monopoly is when there is one seller and there are so many buyers. So this is a situation, if it happens in a particular marketplace, this is a monopoly. For example, I'll give you an example of monopoly here in India. Railway operations. I'm not talking of the railway infrastructure or production of railway engines, production of wagons. I'm not talking of them. I'm talking only about the operations. So railway operations, which means operating the trains on different routes and carrying people and carrying goods. So that is what I am talking about. So railway operations in India, they are monopolized by, it's a monopoly of which organization? Indian Railways, right? No other organization in India as of now has the permission to operate railways, right? They cannot operate trains. So this is one market where you see existence of monopoly. So this is an example of monopoly which exists here in India. However, despite being a monopoly, the Indian Railways does not exploit the customer. The reason is that it is part of the government. So since it is part of the government, it has no desire to exploit the consumers. However, this may not always be the case, and whenever there are some private firms who over the years evolve into monopoly in a particular sector of the economy, they tend to exploit the consumers. So this is what a monopoly is, and that is why we don't want companies to grow into monopolies. We don't want them to become monopolies, right? And that is why this particular act was brought. We didn't want the large scale firms which were there at that point of time to grow so much, to grow into monopolies. We didn't want them to grow into monopolies. That was the reason why this particular act was brought. And the reason why we don't want a particular firm to become a monopoly, a particular firm in a private sector to become monopoly, we don't want. Why do we don't want that? Because if they do, then what will happen? If they become monopoly, then they will start exploiting the customers. They would have greater bargaining power. They would be having a dominant position whenever they are transacting with the consumers. So naturally they are going to exploit them because nobody else. What happens in a monopoly? There's just one single seller and there's so many buyers, so no other seller supplies the same goods. So naturally the buyer has no option but to buy from the only single which is available there, even if the seller is demanding a very high price, or even if the seller is not able to provide the optimum quality, right? And that is why we wanted to rein in, we wanted to control, we wanted to check monopolies from growing here in India. We wanted to check large-scale firms to grow into monopolies here in India. So this was one of the objectives. So let us understand what other objectives were there. As I said, to prevent concentration of economic power. At that point of time, there were some large-scale enterprises, and we didn't want them to wipe out their rivals in the market, to wipe out the other competitive firms in the market and become a dominant economic power. So it's not as if we didn't want them to grow. It was okay for us to want to have them grow, but we didn't want them to grow into a monopoly power. We didn't want the economic power to get concentrated into the hands of a few large-scale enterprises. So this was one reason why this particular act was formulated. As I said, controlling the monopolies, and I have given you the reason why: to promote consumer interest. You know that once a monopoly is there, it is likely to exploit the consumers. And lastly, the objective of this particular act was to prohibit monopolistic, restrictive and unfair trade practices. We have understood what we mean by the monopolistic practices. We'll be talking about what we mean by restrictive and unfair trade practices also. But for now, you need to understand that the main objective of this act was to prohibit these kind of tendencies, prohibit monopolistic practices, prohibit restrictive and prohibit unfair trade practices. So now you must be wondering as to what we mean by restrictive and unfair trade practices, given that now you have a little bit of idea of monopolistic trade practices. So let us understand. We'll start with the monopolistic trade practices. So what is a monopolistic trade policy? Preventing competition in production and supply. So if a firm does not let rival firms produce the same good that it is also producing, or supplying the same goods that it is also supplying, then this can be termed as a monopolistic trade practice. And this was prohibited under the act. And why is this particular firm doing this? Why is a particular firm preventing its competition? The reason is, naturally, if you somehow are able to not let the competition grow, if you don't let the competitive firms to grow, then what will happen? You will be the only seller, you will be the only market player, you would be a monopoly, and then you can exploit the customers, you can charge higher prices, you don't have to worry about losing your customers because of inferior quality of your goods, because you are the only seller. So that is the main objective, and that is why companies tended to prevent competition, and this was termed as monopolistic trade practice. Another monopolistic trade practice was maintaining prices at unreasonable level by limiting production and supply. So firm used to do what? They would restrict their production. So for example, if they are able to produce, let's say, I'm just giving an example, let's say if they are able to produce 100 cars, they would produce only 40. What will happen? You have read the law of supply and demand in the microeconomics subject that you have studied in the first semester. What will happen because of this? There's a company which is the only market player, and it is trying to restrict its production. It's not supplying the quantity that is capable of supplying. It is not producing the quantity that it is capable of producing. It is producing much less than that. It is supplying much less than that in the market, and suppose it is a monopoly, then what will happen? There would be a scarcity situation in the market. You have read in microeconomics what happens when the demand is more than the supply. Supply is less than the demand. What will happen? The prices would rise, and that is the reason why many of the firms indulged in these kind of practices. They used to restrict their production and supply. And this used to be the case in those markets which were basically monopoly kind of markets in their nature, which means that this used to happen only with monopoly companies. Because if you are in a perfect competition kind of a situation in which there are so many sellers who are selling the same wares as you are selling, then if you restrict your production and supply, the customer can switch to some other seller. The customer can buy from somebody else. However, this is just not possible when you are the only firm. You are a monopoly. So this was how some large-scale firms used to misuse their monopoly situation their monopoly status in different markets, and that is what was termed as monopolistic trade practice. Again, allowing quality of goods produced or supplied to deteriorate. Now, can you guess what could have been the reason behind this? To allow quality of goods to deteriorate, to let them rot, to let them get damaged. Why would a company first produce a particular item and then let it deteriorate in quality? Let it get damaged? The reason is that, again, the same objective which they were trying to achieve here, they are also trying to achieve here. If some of the products are damaged, what will happen? There will be a scarcity of the products in the market, and naturally the company will be able to charge much higher prices for its products from the consumers. And that used to be the objective of some companies who indulge in these kind of practices, to cause the prices in the market to increase by restricting production. So either you restrict the production, or if the production has already taken place, what you do, you let the finished goods deteriorate, let them become unfit for consumption, so that there is a scarcity in the market. So these kind of practices were called monopolistic trade practices. Now you can understand the difference between the first point here and the remaining 2 points. Here we are trying not to allow some company to become a monopoly, and here what we are trying here we are trying to not allow, we are trying to restrict the monopolies in different sectors of the economy from exploiting their customers, or from artificially causing the prices of their product in the market to increase, right? And these were termed as monopolistic trade practices. Now let us move over to restrictive trade practices. Now there's a difference between monopolistic and restrictive. What happens in a restrictive trade practice? Please understand. Refusal to deal. So the seller may refuse to deal with a particular buyer, or a segment, or a group, or a class of buyers. So the seller says that, okay, I would not be having any dealing with you, I would not be selling my product to you. Or the customer may tell this to a group of customers. The seller may say this to a group of customers: I am not going to sell my products to you, to the whole group. So this is an example of a restrictive trade practice, the refusal to deal with a particular seller, with a particular buyer, or with a particular group or class of buyers. Now this is what refusal to deal is. Then we have got tying agreements. What do we mean by tying agreements? I hope you know what tying is. So I'll give you an example of what happens in such cases. For example, suppose you have gone to the market and you want to buy, let's say you want to buy a set of colors, a box of colors. But the seller, the shopkeeper, tells you that if you want to buy these colors, you also will have to buy a drawing book. Now you do not want the drawing book, but then since the drawing book has now been tied with the color box that you want to buy, you don't have any other option but to buy both of them, because the seller tells you that if you want to buy the color box, you will have to buy the drawing book also. However, why would you do that? You would do that if the seller is the only seller of color boxes in the market, don't you think? If he is the only seller of the color boxes in the market, then you have no option but to go by his bidding, but to buy both the drawing book as well as the color box as he is telling you to. However, if there are other sellers who are selling the same product in the market, other sellers who are selling the color box in the market, what will you do? You don't want a drawing book, but this particular seller insists that you should also buy a drawing book. What would you do? You would simply switch to some other seller, you would go to some other shop, right? So these kind of tying agreements were more common in those markets which were at that point of time under monopoly control of private capital. So this was common in those markets in which there was monopoly kind of a situation, or almost monopoly kind of a situation. What do I mean by monopoly or almost monopoly? Monopoly means ki there would be just one seller, and almost monopoly, there would be one very large dominant seller, and there would be very small few sellers who are competing with this large and dominant seller, they are simply not able to give him competition. So that is almost like a monopoly. So in such markets, these kind of things used to happen. Tying agreement. So I hope now you have understood tying agreement. If you have to buy the color box, you please also buy the drawing book. So compelling buyers to purchase another item while selling him a particular item. So the example that I took, the buyer was being compelled to purchase the another item was the drawing book, because he was actually there to purchase the color boxes. So while you are selling him the color boxes, you are making him buy another item. What is that another item? The drawing book. Is this okay? So this used to be the case in tying agreements. Let's talk about the third kind of a restrictive trade practice, forcing buyer to deal exclusively in manufacturer's products. So if you as a manufacturer, a firm, forces the buyers to deal exclusively in the manufacturer's products, what do we mean by this? Basically this means that the manufacturer is telling the buyer that you should not deal in products of any other firm. You should be dealing in my products only. That is what is meant by exclusively. So in a way, the manufacturer is compelling the buyer not to have any dealings with any other firm and just to deal in products which are being produced by the manufacturer. Right? So these were the restrictive trade practices, and we have not included all the details. Please understand, I am just giving a brief idea about the different types of restrictive practices or monopolistic practices. Just to give you a brief idea, we are not going into details, right? So I've just taken up 3 points here to define what restrictive trade practices are. Now let's have a look at the unfair trade practices. What do we mean by unfair trade practices? Hoarding of goods causing price to increase. Now here, let's say the seller hoards the goods. The goods have been produced, they have been supplied to the retailer also, but the retailer is hoarding the goods. Why is he hoarding the goods? Again, the same objective, to create an artificial scarcity in the market, which will ultimately lead to rise in the prices, and then the seller would benefit from this situation, and that is why he hoards the goods. Hoards matlab jamakhori, right? So he would not start selling the goods, he would just keep them safe in his house or in his godown or in his warehouse, and the people would not get to know, the consumers would not get to know that the retailer has the goods available with him. The retailer will tell them that he has not received any supply of goods. So this way the retailer would try to create artificial scarcity in the market and to gain from this particular situation, right? Destruction of goods causing prices to increase. Now again, one more thing that the companies used to do at that point of time, they would destroy, they would damage the goods so that they become unfit for consumption. Naturally there would be a reduction in supply and the demand is not changing. There is a reduction in supply, which means the supply would be less than the demand and there would be an increase in price. So this was also termed as an unfair trade practice. Publication of advertisements for sale at bargain price and not doing the same. Many a times some companies would publish advertisements telling the customers that the product is available at a discount, is available at a bargain price, very cheap price, which is much below the actual cost of production of that particular item. This would lead to the customer thronging the retailer or thronging the manufacturer to buy that product because the advertisement has been published that the product is available at a bargain price. However, when so many customers come and demand the product, what will happen? The seller would refuse to offer them, to give them a bargain price. So the seller has initially published an advertisement promising that he would be selling the products at the bargain price, but when the customers start turning up, he refuses to sell the product at bargain prices, he refuses to sell them at lower prices. Now this was another unfair trade practice under the MRTP Act. And why would a particular seller indulge in these kind of, why would he come out with these kind of false advertisements which are not depicting the real picture? The reason was very simple, just to attract the customers. So to attract the customers, you have promised them a very low price, but when they actually turn up, you refuse to sell them the goods at that low price. So this again was an unfair trade practice. Now false claims. So false claims made by the companies regarding the quality of their product, regarding the potency of their product, regarding the manufacturing date. So all these false claims came under the purview of unfair trade practices. They were defined as unfair trade practices. So many times companies wrongly claimed that the product is of superior quality while it actually turned out to be of inferior quality. Many times they exaggerate their claims regarding the usefulness of the product. So these were basically unfair trade practices. All these false claims were considered to be unfair trade practices. This is fine. Now that we have understood the whole background of the act, what was the objective that the government tried to achieve using the MRTP Act, and according to the act, what was meant by the monopolistic trade practices, restrictive trade practices, and the unfair trade practices, we will now move on to the organization which was set up to oversee, to supervise the implementation of the MRTP Act, and that particular entity used to be called the MRTP Commission. And I'll tell you that the companies which, owing to their large volumes, their large size, fell under the purview of the MRTP Commission or fell under the purview of MRTP Act 1969, used to be called the MRTP companies. Since the act was basically for controlling and reining in the large-scale enterprises, most of the large-scale enterprises at that point of time, they were brought under the purview of the act, and they were called the MRTP companies. So MRTP Commission had the job of actually investigating whether the law is being implemented in word and spirit, and to actively take up cases of violation of the law. So they would do what? In case there is some unfair trade practice going on somewhere, they can take an action based on some complaint filed in front of them, or they can also take action. They could have also taken action suo moto. Suo moto means on their own volition, without anybody lodging a complaint to them. So that is what we are going to discuss in the next session. We'll be talking about the constitution of the MRTP Commission, and we'll be talking about the powers that were delegated to the MRTP Commission. And then, just to understand why Competition Act replaced MRTP Commission and MRTP Act 1969, we will also be discussing why the MRTP Act failed. What were the drawbacks? What were the lacuna which were not addressed, because of which the Act was not able to realize its objectives, right? So that will be our agenda for the next discussion. Thank you very much.